podcast, The Neil Haley Show in the Storehouse Media Group podcast with our host, Sherry from Storehouse Media Group. Sherry, how are you? We just keep going on and on in the middle of the summer, and not many people are having these superstars. We continue to have them.
I know, and I love it. And we're just going to keep going on, and that's good with me. And especially with today's guest, I'm super excited to talk with him.
Awesome. Who do we have today?
We have Daniel Luzader, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. And what he's doing is he's casting this critical eye with two of the most controversial books in the last year, which we'll talk about. He's also earned the American Bar Association National Award for Public Service, and he was named a member of the Scripps Howard Journalism Hall of Fame. And I mean, he has so many accolades. It's like, wow. And so I really am excited to talk to him because the two books he has coming out are The Manchurian Journalist and Street Talk. And those are coming out June 18th. I mean, one came out June 18th. They both came out in June 18th, right, of 2024. And yeah, I'm looking forward to. So welcome, Dan.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Thanks for
How do you
having
have
me.
time? How do you have time to write two books at once to get them out at the same time?
Well, the funny story is the Manchurian Journalist took about 5 years to put together, and Street Talk's a collection of newspaper columns that I wrote when I was at a medium-sized newspaper in Indiana. It was where the Pulitzer Prize material came from, so some of that is in there. But actually, my daughter put that collection together for me. She's a lawyer up in Washington State now, and she thought it'd be a good idea to memorialize some of these columns from the 1980s. So.
Yeah, you have your career was marked by high-profile stories. You have a lot of experience investigating political corruptness and criminal networks, and you're an expert or an authority in Al Qaeda, right? Which I thought was
Well,
really interesting.
I wouldn't say I'm an expert on Al Qaeda by any means.
Uh,
In fact, it's the subject of the Manchurian Journalist, Lawrence Wright, who's the expert on Al Qaeda. But I'm more of a more knowledgeable about journalism and journalism's operations. I started reporting when I was 17 years old. I was a police reporter when I was still a teenager, and that was in the days of hot type, believe it or not, when newspapers were still produced with linotypes and typewriters. But I've covered a lot of interesting stories. I've done high profile national stories on political corruption, and I covered Columbine. I did the inside story on the police investigation into Columbine, and I've had a very interesting career in journalism and learned a lot along the way, I think.
So, what made you specialize in specifically like criminal types of journalism?
I started out as a police reporter. I was a I was a very naive kid when I walked into my first newsroom. I grew up in an evangelical environment. The most exciting thing that had ever happened in my life was the church social. But within a couple of days on police beat, I was beginning to see a whole different world that I was really attracted to, a world that most people never get a hard look at. Plus, I got caught up in the excitement of deadline reporting. I liked it. I liked the adrenaline. So I wound up, however, becoming a columnist for 7 years. I pretty much wrote about common people and small situations and things I found interesting. But it wasn't enough. I did my first investigative story on an unsolved hotel arson and turned up some corruption, government corruption involved in that investigation. And then I decided to pursue an offer with the Indianapolis Star to come onto their investigative team and do investigative reporting, and I've done that ever since.
Oh,
Well, let's talk about the Manchurian Journalist, the subtitle being Lawrence Wright, the CIA and the Corruption of American Journalism. And what you're talking about is what's got to be done to restore the independence and integrity of America's watchdog of democracy. and that's his independent journalism. So all this stuff going on, how does this all tie into current events that's going on? I mean, what happened to former President Trump on Saturday and everything, that's led up to it. How does that tie in together?
Well, I started looking at this issue in sort of a circuitous way. I got a call from the Church of Scientology. They were reestablishing a magazine that they had published before, and they wanted to talk to me about the coverage, the media coverage of the church. And they contended it was biased, and they wanted me to take a look and examine it. So I did. And I found that they had some arguments that were fairly substantial. But in the course of that, Lawrence Wright, who is a writer for The New Yorker, is very high profile, done documentary films. He had written Going Clear, a book about the church. And I began to take a look at that book. As I was doing so, I researched Wright's background and discovered some things that had never been reported about him. He had written a memoir in the mid-1980s that told a story that turned out to have several fabrications in it. And as I looked further into the story, I discovered a network of intelligence operations tied to the CIA, but more tied to the anti-communist Cold War activities following World War II. And this network had put together basically a recruiting program to bring journalists that were favorable to their ideology, to bring them forward into the media, to bring them into publishing, to encourage writers. And there were several different programs that I examined that were used for that purpose. It was basically propaganda activities in the Cold War that were supposed to be directed outside the US, but were actually used to propagandize the American people.
Wow. And learning, so what do you think that's needed for that type of journalist that we don't see that type of journalist? How do you define that or see the kind of propaganda?
Well, the problem is it's hard to see. And the publisher of the Manchurian Journalist noted in a foreword that Senator Church, when he did congressional hearings into the use of journalists and the use of priests and academians and others to create an intelligence network outside of the CIA, but deeply connected to it, that these things were hard to discover, and they are. Lawrence Wright's never talked about his history, but he did write a memoir about becoming a journalist and his path to journalism. And it was pulling apart that memoir that I discovered that he had minimized some things about his background that were rather important. His father, who was a military guy and very strong on patriotic matters, and Wright disagreed over the war in Vietnam, and Wright became a conscientious objector. And he was approved by the Dallas Draft Board in his application to be a conscientious objector on the strength of an essay. Well, I contacted conscientious objectors from the Vietnam era and talked to them almost universally. It was a very difficult process to become a CO. But Wright managed to do it with an essay. As I pursued his discussion of his path, I discovered that he attended a little class at Radcliffe College in Boston after he graduated from college. He talked about it in his memoir. It was a class that was really a recruiting program tied to the CIA to bring journalists and others into publishing, into media. It was run by a woman named Helen Venn. None of that has ever been reported before. It's being reported here for the first time. And he also participated in a program then at American University in Cairo that was also tied to CIA propaganda activity. So as I pulled apart the history of all this and examined it, I raised some questions as to why he'd never disclosed a very interesting fact about his father's boss. His father's boss was a man named Robert Story. And Robert Story was also chief executive trial prosecutor at the Nuremberg war trials. He was head of the American Bar Association. He was head of the International Bar Association. He was head of the Board of Foreign Scholarships, the Fulbrights that were used to recruit people in the anti-communist Cold War responses to the Soviet Union. And Wright never mentioned this very interesting connection. And the reason was that I think the reason was that Robert Story helped form this network that involved not just the CIA, but banks, law firms, others with powerful positions in our culture.
Hmm.
Well, we've all heard of the Manchurian Candidate, but you've named the journalist. Why did you choose that title for your book? I
It
thought that
seemed
was interesting.
it seemed appropriate to me. The Manchurian Candidate is a fictional story about an individual who is brainwashed to commit a political act of violence. But the essence of the story is about the ability to get people to do things that are not suspected of them. And so, in looking at Lawrence Wright's journalism, the history of his journalism, particularly, he won the Pulitzer Prize in 2007 for his book on Al Qaeda, and a very influential book in how we look at terror and terrorism in the United States. And so it occurred to me that there was something of a similar nature going on here, not suggesting that Lawrence Wright was brainwashed, but I think he had contacts and activities within the Central Intelligence Agency and associates of the agency who helped him in his career. And they helped him become the prominent journalist he is today.
Wow.
And I think he has declined to talk to me about that or comment about it. I'd like to know more about it. I've encouraged him many times to respond to my questions, but he decided not to do that, which is his right.
Now, my question to you is then you're saying a lot of journalists have been infiltrated in the industry that are working for other people or have other agendas. That's pretty much part of the reason why you wrote this book, right? Is to
in part. But the history of this has not been completely disguised. Carl Bernstein, for the Rolling Stone in the late 1970s, wrote about the CIA's Operation Mockingbird. And the Operation Mockingbird was a recruiting program for journalists. And he didn't name them, but he suggested in his piece there were 400 American journalists who were either on the payroll or had done work for the agency. Okay. So that was significant in my research in taking a look at this. How many people are recruited or offered or encouraged by the agency or unwittingly participating in something that might not be appropriate for the American public? It's hard to say, almost impossible to say.
Since you were a teenage police reporter, do you think American journalism is becoming worse, or you're just more attuned to it or open to it?
I think journalism's lost its way, and there have been a number of factors that have contributed to that. But one of them I see, I was a small town police reporter, and I moved up into ever larger newspapers until Columbine, and I left newspapers after Columbine and became a freelancer. But I think one of the things that's happened is with the decline and the disappearance of newspapers, the institutional nature, the institutional knowledge that came to journalism has deteriorated, if not almost disappeared. When you came in the era that I came in as a police reporter, there were mentors in the newsroom. They were gruff and they were tough and they smoked cigars and cigarettes and pipes in the newsroom, and they swore and they drank whiskey there, and they were colorful, but they taught you things. They taught you how to build source networks. They taught you how to deal with sources. They taught you how to be there. They taught you where the back door was to City Hall that got you down to the holding cells where they kept somebody that just been arrested, where you could get an interview. The kinds of things that don't happen in journalism today because that institutional structure is not there. We've lost a lot of source building. Newspapers have suffered financially. They've cut their staffs. They've gotten rid of older reporters. They've hired younger reporters at a lower salary that don't have the experience, don't know how to build source networks, work their way through. And I think the institution of journalism in this country, which is so important to maintaining this democratic ideal, has slipped.
All right. Where's the best place people can buy both your books?
Well, they're available on Amazon. The Manchurian Journalist is available through Trine Day. Street Talk was published by a publisher in Ohio, Britain Publishing, but mostly Amazon, Barnes and Noble.
Okay. We appreciate it. Thanks
Thank
again.
you very
So
much.
much.
All right. That was the special simulcast of the Neil Haley Show and the Storehouse Media